right, I think we are recording. Welcome to our first alumni chat of fall 2022. Great to have all of you who are here live, and for those of you who are watching the recording, I hope you enjoy this conversation. I want to thank Ian for being here today. Ian is a writer for the morning newsletter at the New York Times and is a 2017 graduate from the college. So Ian, over to you. Can you describe a little bit in more detail what your day looks like, what the kind of work that you're doing looks like, and even a little bit of what you've done in the past in order to get to where you are?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, thanks for having me, Jackie. It's nice to see everyone, so to speak. I'm really happy to be here. So if you do have questions, I'd love to answer them by the end. I want this to be as helpful as it can be for you. So I will try to keep my answers brief. But yeah, no, so Jackie said it exactly right. I am a writer for the New York Times working on the morning newsletter, which is sort of our flagship email newsletter that goes out every morning, as the name would suggest, at 6:30 a.m. Monday through Sunday. So it's every day. And has a readership of about 5 million people every day. So David Leonhardt is the briefing's main writer, and he sort of brought me on to help reimagine and relaunch this newsletter back in May of 2020. So it's been a totally pandemic project, and obviously COVID is a big part of what we write about. But the idea was kind of to diversify the idea of what a front page is for the newspaper, right? We have the print front page, which everyone is familiar with, and is historically sort of the main way that journalists present the most important information and give it to readers. But in a digital age, we also have other ways of doing that. We have a website that is constantly changing throughout the day, shows you the most important information. It's sort of like a front page, but we're able to change it. We're able to put news stories in prominent places so that people coming to the website see the most important news or something that's broken just minutes before. But we also have other ways of doing it. We have a flagship podcast that you might have heard of called The Daily, which is sort of another way of presenting the most important story or the story you shouldn't miss in an audio format. And then the idea was to sort of make the newsletter another front page, right? It is, the basic format is a sort of 600 to 800 word analysis piece, usually an explainer on some big news of the day. It's sort of, we think of it as, we call it the lead, our sort of main essay. But then below that is sort of a series of bullets that are grouped thematically into sections. So you might have updates on politics, updates on COVID, updates on the war in Ukraine. These are sort of meant to give people a sense of what has happened in the last 24 hours. It's meant to be, it comes out once a day, just like the print paper does, but it's sort of meant to inform you about what has happened over the past day that you should know about. And then we have other stuff that the paper has, right? It has, the newspaper has arts coverage, it has culture coverage, it has just fun, quirky, clicky stories that people want to read and talk about. We often, when we're writing the newsletter, we'll often use this test of, would you turn to your partner or your friend at breakfast and tell them about this? And if you would, that's something that should be in the newsletter. We want to give people things that are not just news and not just updates on sort of important goings on in the world, but also things that are entertaining and exciting and thought-provoking. And so that's a purpose of the newsletter as well. And then below that, we sort of have, like I said, sort of arts coverage, music, fashion, movies. We have a section of sports coverage, which is kind of new. The Times recently acquired The Athletic, a sports journalism site. And so we have sort of a section that's written in our newsletter by athletic writers every day. So that's like a little piece of the paper. Basically, I would think of the newsletter as like a place where a lot of the pieces of the New York Times live in one spot, and that readers can sort of engage with every day. And then, like I said, it goes out every morning at around 6:30 a.m. My work it's interesting, it kind of varies day to day, but I'm usually involved in sort of writing the news bullets. I usually focus on politics and sort of government stuff. That's sort of what I focus on in my journalism. So it's often the parts of the newsletter you read about those things, about those news stories in the past 24 hours. I usually have written those. We also do a lot of coverage of politics. We're in a midterm year where a lot of interesting things are happening in American politics. So our lead item at the very top, that 600 to 800 word piece, is often about politics. I sometimes co-write that. I sometimes do the research for it. I sometimes do the reporting for it. I fact check the newsletter at the end of the night. So it's quite like, every day is a little bit different because our remit is sort of to write about anything we want, which can be a blessing and a curse. We get to write about COVID. We get to write about new studies in race relations. We get to write about, I'm trying to think of we get to write about the war in Ukraine and sort of give people updates as the war is changing. But as a result, it's very freeing. We get to write about a whole lot of things. My day is always different day to day. And I should have said at the beginning, I sort of work as part of a team. David is the main writer, but there's a few other writers and editors that we all meet collectively in the morning, talk about what the next day's newsletter is going to be, and sort of start planning out the different sections that we want to have. So every day is a little bit different, but that's sort of the basic framework that everything is trying to fit into. Did that answer your question, Jackie? I know that went on for a little while.
No, that's good. It gives everyone a sense of, I was thinking as you were going through this, it's like, I know it's not just Ian doing this, and I know he's
correct. It's not. It would be quite a bit for any one person to do. It would be quite impossible. But so yeah, it's a great team. I mean, it's exciting to be part of a group working on a project like this, and it's been entirely under COVID. So we have all met in person at this point, but there was quite a while when we had not, and we're still working through Zoom, unfortunately.
And that's going to be a question I have later,
yes.
With like the trends in journalism, especially work from home and virtual. But
yes.
I'm thinking like this is, I think, a dream job for a lot of students who are looking at what you've done. I believe you started working for the morning newsletter when you left Georgetown. So maybe casting your mind back, like what are the things that best prepared you to kind of land where you are?
Yeah, it's like, so I started working for the Times right after college. I worked initially for David in another capacity. He was an opinion columnist on the opinion side of the newspaper. So I was hired to be his assistant, and some of the work was very similar, right? It was a lot of reporting, it was a lot of writing, it was a lot of researching, sort of a lot of editing of his work. And he invited me to sort of come along with him when he moved to this new role. So that was actually my first job at the Times. But yeah, I think in terms of how I got to journalism, I think I always preface this when I talk to students or other people who are looking for career advice, that a lot of this will sound very deliberate and sort of like there was a path laid out and I just followed it. And in the actual living of it, it feels very much a different way, right? It felt very winding. It did not feel deliberate. And I also want to emphasize that I think my approach to journalism was sort of like, I'm going to try this until the industry kicks me out. And it hasn't kicked me out yet, which I'm excited about, but maybe we can talk about this later. It is an industry that's undergoing some challenges right now. And so I do want to be honest about that. And I think there are some interesting creative solutions out there to the challenges, but I do think the challenges are pretty real. And so the other element I want to stress is like, there's a lot of luck involved, right? I think I never thought I would end up at a place like the Times. I'm very lucky to be there. And I do think there are lots of things you can do and I'm happy to talk about them, to sort of increase your odds of getting lucky, increase your odds of like having that experience or meeting that person that leads to a job. But there is an amount of luck involved. And I do think it's an important factor to acknowledge, especially when telling the story in retrospect can make it seem very clear cut, or any narrative seems very tidy. And I just want to emphasize that it's always a process of like figuring things out, even for people, no matter where they end up. But yeah, I mean, I sort of always loved writing from an early age, but it was mostly creative writing. I'm home in Maine, where I'm from, and I was cleaning out old papers and I found a bunch of like old stories that I started and never finished, but it's all creative writing. And in high school, I worked for the literary magazine. We didn't have a school paper other than in 5th grade, which we sort of started as a little class. So I didn't really venerate journalists. I think a lot of journalists like picked up the front page of the Times once as a kid and sort of fell in love with it. And I never had that experience. I read journalism, but I didn't really understand what it was. I sort of thought it was stenography, kind of brainless, even though I did enjoy magazines and National Geographic and The Atlantic and Slate. I would read those sorts of things, but I never really saw it as a career path or an option. But I do think by the time I got to Georgetown, I was really interested in studying history. I was really interested in politics. I also had this love of writing. And I sort of quickly realized that journalism could be a way to marry those things. I did take a couple of higher level journalism courses in college, but my main experience was really working for the school newspaper, one of the school newspapers, the Voice, just because they allowed me to jump right in and start writing. And I think you learn a lot that way. I certainly learned a lot that way through trial and error, and it was a lot of error, just figuring out how to put together a newspaper, how to make judgments about news. I think that's very valuable, and to do it in like an environment where you can make mistakes, although, ideally you won't, but you will. That happens, and I think that's like, it's not protective exactly, but you have sort of peers that you're figuring it out with, and I actually think that's a good way to learn. I also did internships, obviously, and I think that's something that I would emphasize. You're in DC, if you're at Georgetown, and you have a lot of news outlets that are right there, particularly if you're interested in covering politics, as I was. So I did a spring internship at CBS News during the beginning of the 2016 election. So I was sort of helping out with their politics coverage. I then sort of went to Politico and did a very quick fellowship there. And then I went to Slate magazine over the summer and was sort of doing writing analysis pieces. So I think another thing I would emphasize is like having exposure to lots of different kinds of news outlets to sort of try them on and see which one works. I was interested in seeing what television was like, and I think it probably wasn't for me in the end. And then Politico is a place that's very reporting driven, right? It's about unearthing new information. And that is sort of the lifeblood of that publication. And then Slate was very different. It was sort of about sitting back and taking the news that others had reported and trying to make an argument about it or fit it into some way of helping readers understand it. So I think those are all different like functions in journalism that it's worth that for me, it felt like valuable to experience directly. And then the last thing I'll say is sort of about the role of luck. I mean, I was in a journalism course, and that journalism course, that professor was sort of putting on an event at Georgetown about the Pentagon Papers, an anniversary of the Pentagon Papers. And I happened to be there, like helping set up. I had volunteered to help with this. And a friend in the class said, "Oh, somebody at the Times is looking for an editorial assistant. Did you see this?" And I had not seen this. And so that was how I found the job that I ended up applying for and ended up doing after college. So I do think there's, to the point of how like there are things you can do to be in the right place, right? Obviously taking that course and helping out with that event was, and making that friend was really helpful. But there is a degree of luck in this. And I mean, again, I think that it's worth emphasizing that because it often sort of gets lost. But yeah, that's how I ended up working for David. I worked for another opinion columnist. And then, as I said, he sort of brought me along to work on The Morning after he had moved over to the news side.
Well, it's interesting because we didn't even, beforehand when we were discussing questions, I didn't even talk about networking because it's, you brought it up. I mean, even though you said the luck piece, but there was, yep. I mean, what I'm hearing, it's more it is relationship building. So I always say to students that networking is not, it's relationship building. And mm-hmm. that's really what you were doing. So it seems like that was an element of the luck. It might have been
it was
the right time, but it was also building good relationships with people.
It was, and I will say that I think Georgetown has advantages there, right? After I saw this job and was interested in applying for it, I reached out to a previous assistant who had worked for this person, just to pick their brain and ask them what it was like to work for her and what it was like to apply to the Times and for advice about how to do that. And I think it's one of the things that I will say about journalism is it's remarkable how much people that are quite important, I think, and have better things to do are willing to talk to undergrads if you ask, or oftentimes that's true. You can't hurt yourself by asking to get coffee or to bounce some ideas off of somebody. I think especially if you're familiar with their work, there's a way to flatter them. Hopefully it's genuine, but I think there is a way to just say, to be earnest and to be honest, like, look, I'm really interested in this. I would love any advice that you might have to give. And I think that it takes courage to do that. It was not something that I think always came naturally to me. But I hope that's instructive that, reaching out to people often pays dividends and people are more willing to help you than you might think.
Also, it's funny, it's like another thing that I didn't put on here. I was thinking about Twitter and where
Yes.
like writers and reporters often live. Now,
Yes.
I don't know, I'm curious what your thoughts are. Or do you still actively engage as a reporter on Twitter? Do you encourage if students who want to become writers, reporters, should they be actively engaged on Twitter? What are your Twitter thoughts?
Yeah, I think I have a perspective on it. I also think others could have a different perspective. So I'll say both sides. I think my perspective is the way I mostly use Twitter is as a news gathering tool, like seeing what information that's out there, especially when it just breaks, seeing ideas that are floating out there or that people are debating has often been ways that I have found ideas that turn into what I think of as great pieces that I'm very proud of. I think that is a way to get information. So I use it as a form of intake more than I use it as an outlet for my thoughts or my work. I do put my work out there, but generally speaking, I think part of it is, I think there are people that would tell you it's worth cultivating an online brand. And I think in some ways that is true. I have not done that. And I don't think it's absolutely necessary. Let me put it that way. I think it can be helpful. I think there is still value in it. And I do think there are journalistic outfits that want to hire people that have sort of a presence like that or have a cultivated voice where they're known or they're engaged in those conversations more than I tend to engage in them as more than just an observer. I also think I think you can see and I'm not saying anything secret here, this is public. The Times put out a memo about journalists on Twitter. And I think the tone of it was a little bit that the Times and other companies are starting to see Twitter more as either a nuisance or a waste of time or something that's dangerous to journalist career. I think it is easy for people to say things that they should not be saying, that are inadvised, that are meant to be funny, don't turn out that way, that can be offensive and hurtful. I think it really is. If you are going to be using it to put things out there, I would be careful. And I would think about, not that you have to be boring, but I would just think about the fact that people can see this and potentially can live forever. People can dredge it back up even if you delete it. I think it's important to be mindful of that. I do think it's a fine line. It can be valuable for journalists to cultivate that voice and that presence. It can also be a little bit dangerous. And so my approach is to be a little bit less public on Twitter, but I'd use it avidly as a resource of information gathering. And I think that's where it's really useful. I do think there are other people that could speak more to the idea of like how to cultivate an online brand than I can, whether to do so, how much it's been valuable to their career. I don't particularly think it's been valuable to mine. I think it has been in terms of information gathering, but not in terms of putting things out there. So that's my perspective, and it's a limited one. And I basically just want to acknowledge that that's the case.
No, I think that's helpful. And I think things change so quickly. In 5 years, like when you graduated, I feel like Twitter was one of the ways that people recommended reporters cultivating a presence or writers, and things change quickly.
Yeah, that's true. And it is still a way that a lot of people do cultivate a presence. So I don't want to say it's irrelevant or it's unimportant, but I think it's a tool. It's one tool, and it's something to use advisedly.
But engage cautiously.
Yes, exactly.
Mindfully.
Yes,
okay.
I think that's
so for students that are looking to, that they're at that point where they're starting to apply, a lot of questions I get are about portfolios. And when you and I talked about this briefly, and I'd love to hear about just your thoughts regarding portfolios and what has been helpful for you or not helpful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure. I know that there is this question about needing personal websites or places where all your clips live. I never made one for myself. I generally have not found that that's been something people have asked for when I've applied to jobs. So therefore, I don't think it's truly necessary. I do think having a good stable of clips, things that you've written for your college paper, if you're sort of early or in internships, work that you've produced, videos that you've produced, audio that you've produced, I think is really valuable. And I think that just speaks to your experience, and it speaks to sort of the work that you have done, the work that you can do. I think in hiring, generally speaking, the quality of the work is the most important factor. That's been my experience. And so it doesn't need to come in the form of a student website, I don't think, or a website of your own. But I do think it needs to be there somewhere. And I think my approach is always to have, you know, a sort of a short list of clips that I was really proud of, that I would bring to, that I would send in. Often publications in their internship applications would ask for them, as you would expect. They're almost like, think of them as writing samples. Like these are things that you're sending in to prove that you have some ability, or have done this for another outlet, or have done this for your school paper. But yeah, I mean, I think it's important to have that. And so finding ways to build up those clips, right? Writing for the school paper, doing internships, is I think the most important piece of it, is having the actual evidence that are interested in this work, you've done the work, you have something to show for that. So I think the presentation matters a little bit less. I think it's the quality of what you have, and the fact of having it at all, that is important.
No, thanks. That's really helpful. I mean, I usually, that's my initial thoughts when
Yep.
I'm talking to folks.
Sometimes the initial thoughts are right. I think exactly right. Yeah.
And that's what I've heard over the years. So I just want to make sure it's helpful for me to hear. And I think for the students too, who are just starting that, either the internship or like that entry level process.
Yeah.
The other thing that I'm thinking about as they're preparing, you're also skills and qualities. Now, whether it's what the Times is looking for, or just what are you seeing are pretty important skills. Now, something you had mentioned is that the diversity of the places that you're working, so different kinds of news. So yeah. I heard you talk about a little bit about broadcast, like it's not where you ended, it's not your interest, but you had a little bit of that, so you could speak to that even a little knowledgeably when you went in. So just any thoughts regarding like what can best prepare a person to put them in a good place for getting that internship or getting a job?
Yeah, no, I do. I think skills are like are fundamentally what hirers are looking for. I mean, I am not a recruiter, but my sense is that showing a demonstrated ability to do this work and do it well is really the most important piece of your application, if you're applying to an internship or if you're applying for a job. So yeah, I mean, I would say, I mean, it again, like Jackie just said, it depends on what kind of journalism you're interested in. If you're interested in going the broadcast direction, having produced videos, having those production skills are really important. That is not less important for me because I sort of knew I wanted to be writing, and you can be a writer on TV too, but I knew I wanted to be sort of writing in the newspaper format. So for me, I would say it really is about mechanics at some level. It's, can you write a lead? Can you do interviews that unearth important information or good quotes? Are you able to get your facts straight so that you don't have corrections at the bottom of your stories? I think this is not, people are always going to make mistakes, so that's okay. I have had plenty of corrections, but I think that sort of skill building and just showing it is really important. So it really is about, like, you know, writing clearly, writing concisely, writing effectively to communicate a point. If you're making a sort of more argumentative analysis, I think writing persuasively. Those are, to me, the skills that are important. And I think writing with readers in mind is another thing that I would encourage. I guess I wish it had been, it's something I've had to sort of learn in the newsletter business, but I think writing to be understood and not to show how smart you are, or writing through jargon to cut through it, not to show that you have can use that word, right? Like, I think journalists sometimes make the mistake of assuming readers know too much, and readers are very smart. Times readers, I love them, but I think it's important to be clear about what we mean, and sometimes that means really simplifying, or like really asking yourself, what is it I'm trying to communicate in this paragraph? What is it I'm trying to communicate in this sentence? Like, is there something that's going to trip a reader up? They're just not going to understand what I'm trying to communicate, or why this information is important. So I think, especially when, like, you know, we're writing explainers for the newsletter, I think it's important to tell people what they're supposed to take away and then give the evidence of why. And I think that's a skill that takes time to build up. It takes like experience doing it. I'm always learning every day how to do it better, and it's been an adjustment for me to try to write that way. So I think it really is sort of like, it sounds quite granular, but I think it's the most important thing, is really like, can you do the work, or can you learn? because I think that's the other piece is like, I know that I did not have all these skills when I came to the Times even. It took time to build them up. And a lot of people were very helpful to me in pushing me to do them better. And so I think that's finding those mentors that are going to push you, or finding jobs where you're going to be able to stretch, or you're going to have feedback from editors on your work, I think is the way that you can build up some of those skills.
Yeah, it was interesting that, because it's almost advice to my younger self. I think you said that, but like writing to be understood. I think I was trying to think like write to be understood.
Yes.
You had something else. It'll come back into the brain sometime later.
No worries.
That's it. It'll come back. So I'm debating whether or not, to talk or to even think about like what, because I know the Times is something that students would really like to work in. They have a few fellowship programs. I know that there's one that is, I think the timeline is either just over or still going. I think it's the editorial one. I'm not sure. But I know that a lot of the fellowships are not guaranteed jobs afterwards. And I think that's important for students to know, because they're very sought after. And also knowing that, like you said, the different roads in, like you didn't have a fellowship coming in, but the fellowship is there for people who want to do it. So it's the question is, will I get a job at the Times if I get the fellowship? Maybe, or maybe not. It really depends on need. How and maybe this will come a little bit under the emerging trends area. But what do you see as like the health, maybe like the health of print journalism, and maybe even the Times? So tapping a bunch of things here, like in terms of recruiting and what you're seeing just as a journalist, and for new hires and all of that. So if you want to play in that space, that was a superly awkwardly worded question, but if you want to play in there, go for it.
No, it was really rich. There's a lot there. So I guess I'll start with the end first. I think journalism is an industry that is undergoing some struggles, right? I think a lot of the way that journalism was done in the past has changed. And I think it's first and foremost like sort of a business problem. And I am not the best mind to think about that. But I think fundamentally like the model of sustaining publications, especially print ones, especially local ones or regional ones, has been really damaged by the arrival of digital advertising by things like Facebook, where that obviate the need for print advertising, which was the sort of model of supporting local papers. If you go back and look at archives of the New York Times from the 1960s, or from even subsequent decades, so much of the paper is advertisements. So much of the paper is, and that is really, it is on the page how the Times made its money, and how the Times was able to sustain the journalism that was in between the ads, right? The work that we all did as journalists was paid for by advertisements in the paper. And that was the way it worked across the country. And that at one point did sustain a quite thriving media ecosystem, where you had local papers, you had regional papers, mid-level papers, and then you had sort of national outlets, the Times, the Post, the LA Times. And a lot of them could sort of field foreign bureaus. They could have reporters in other countries in ways that are harder for many of them to sustain now. One of my favorite examples of this is actually the new executive editor of the Times, Joe Kahn, was freelancing for the Dallas Morning News in China. So the Dallas Morning News could fund a reporter, not even on staff, but could fund a reporter to be in China, to be reporting on China. And this would have been in maybe the 80s or the 90s. So that sort of illustrates the difference now. A lot of local papers have really had to cut back. I have not worked in a local paper environment, but I've talked to a lot of people who have. And I think it's difficult, right? I think journalists are stretched very thin. They're being asked to do things that would have been done. They're being asked to cover beats that really take multiple people, right? Things like the State House, things like education, things like police beats, local crime. Sometimes those are done by a single person. And so that's not going to, no one person can sort of cover all of those areas. And so I think that's really difficult. I also think there has been a move, and the Times is part of this move, to understand that print advertising is not coming back. It's not going to sustain this kind of business model. And so a new business model has to replace it. And at the Times, at least, which is doing very well with this transition, the transition has been to ask for subscribers to pay for the journalism. Obviously, newspapers always cost money, but increasingly at the Times, and you can see this in our public filings, the journalism that is being done by the newspaper is increasingly supported by its readers, right? It's increasingly supported by people buying subscriptions to the Times, to the main paper, to cooking, to other to games, to other features that the paper offers. And that money is a bigger and bigger share of the revenue that we bring in. And print advertising is a smaller and smaller share of the revenue that we bring in. So subscription models are one approach to this problem of what's happening in journalism overall. It's one answer to that question of what is the next business model that's going to replace the one that came before. Another answer is nonprofit news. So having someone who is a rich donor, or having donors in general. ProPublica is an excellent example of how this can work. The Texas Tribune is another example of how this can work. And there are locally focused ones. I think VT Digger in Vermont is a good example of places that are reliant on donors, but are producing public interest journalism. I think that's a really sustainable, encouraging model for how, another way basically to get readers to pay for the journalism that's being produced. The Post obviously has Jeff Bezos as its funder, so that's another model, is having a wealthy individual purchase a paper and agree to fund it, even if it is not as profitable as it might otherwise be. So I think those are some answers to the challenge of what's going on in journalism, and I'm speaking only about print media chiefly, or online media, things that the world that I know a little bit better. But that's, so I do think it's worth, it's unfortunate because I think for a lot of young journalists, going to work at a local paper is great experience. You are going to get a lot of clips. They probably really need you. They need bodies to go be reporters, to drive around to events, to cover them. It will get you experience of actually how to do this in a practical way. And yet it is harder and harder to sustain that kind of a model, and it can be harder. I don't want to say in a blanket way, but it can be harder to parlay that experience into a job at a bigger outlet if regional papers are also suffering in similar ways. So that used to be the model of how people would come up to national papers, is they would work somewhere local, they would move to a regional paper like a USA Today in a particular bureau, or they would move to the Boston Globe, and then if they wanted to, they could move to the Times or the Post. But it was also possible to make a living at those other mid-level papers, or even at a local paper. And I think that is the challenge, is that it's not only a challenge for the industry, it's a challenge for journalists too, to find a way to do the work that's most important, which is often at the local level, holding local officials accountable, knowing what's happening in the State House, given that so much, we've seen this summer how much of, how many changes that affect people's lives very directly are happening at the state level, right? If you look at the aftermath of Roe falling, I think that's a great example, right? What's happening in state houses is going to affect people's lives very intimately. And that is coverage that a national outlet like the Times has bureaus all over the country. We can send reporters to Kansas to cover the referendum there. But ideally, you want strong publications in those states that know the landscape much better, that are more intimately familiar with communities there, that work in the State House every day. They're not just visiting for a particular vote. That's ideally, I think, where the work of informing people about what their public officials are doing happens. And I think there's a lot, I think, that people can, that can slip through the cracks if there aren't those local reporters. So it's difficult. I think it's a difficult moment. It's a really noble calling. It's essential work. It's also not as well paid, and the business model has suffered quite a bit. That's my 3,000 foot down to ground level view of the journalism industry, at least the print side, right now. But I know there was more in your question, Jackie, so I'm happy to bounce to something else if you need.
That's okay. That's I'm thinking Report for America. I know that's not you and about the Times, but what it did occur to me this year is seeing that Report for America's looks for young journalists to be embedded in local papers.
Yep.
And I I'm amazed at the number of openings that there are. So there's something happening there, which I think is really rich and wonderful. So just FYI, happy to talk about Report from America.
Yeah, I second that. They're really good. And yeah, they sort of, their effort to solve that problem is to pay part of the salary of the journalists that they send to a local publication. So that relieves some of the financial pressure on that publication to support a journalist, but it also gives them another journalist that they can then go send to the State House or have cover education, cover abortion rights, whatever it might be. So yes, I think that's a great example, and I'm glad you brought it up.
So apart from a changing business model, we also had COVID, and we still do have it with us. But when it first hit, that hurt journalism quite badly. And but not only that, it skewed just hiring and timelines even more. We all know that they're all over the place, but also work from home. Like, you have been virtual for a very, very long time. I think you're going back. So anything that's come out of COVID that you want to maybe like a shift in the industry that you think is here to stay?
That's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. Yes, first, I think it's right to acknowledge that there was sort of a wave of news outlets that really suffered at the beginning of COVID, right? This was another example of sort of accelerating a trend that was already there, of print advertising collapsing. People had less reason to go out and buy papers. People had less reason to go out, and businesses had less reason to go out and put ads in the paper. And that hurts papers ultimately. That's right. So it was a part of a broader sort of economic downturn that we saw at the beginning of COVID. And the unfortunate truth is, yeah, some of those publications have not come back or are not going to come back. And so, yeah, I think that's right. I think that, my experience of it has been interesting because, we started this team sort of revamping the newsletter and relaunching it under COVID. And I think one of the advantages is that, when the flu pandemic in 1918 hit, there was no remote work, right? There was no ability to do the kind of work that we are now able to do through screens. And so I think there have been innovations and advantages to that as well. I think a lot of us have proven that we still can do this work from home, right? We can do this work through screens. Sometimes it's advantageous to not be clustered in New York or clustered in DC, and to be up in Maine, for example, where I am right now, while there's an election going on, or as I was for 2020, or while there's abortion rights debates happening in the State House, or while there's a governor's race, while there are midterm elections. I do think there's an advantage to getting outside of, particularly for national outlets, getting outside of the major metropolitan areas and covering a country that is very diverse, very different than it might look from big cities. So I think that has been an advantage. I think there have been advantages in hiring too, where my view is that it has enabled, being remote has enabled hiring people who don't need to be coming into New York or coming into DC to do their coverage. And I think that's very valuable. But yeah, I mean, in terms of things that are here to stay, I don't know. I think that's yet to be seen. I think, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to answer that. I think some of the flexibility that's there, or some of the flexibility that people have discovered, has made an impression on them, and certainly it has changed my approach to work or my outlook on work, where I think I can get work done and where I need windows in my day to do other things. I do wonder how much it's going to be a lasting thing that affects subsequent people in the workforce, like people who didn't go through COVID in an office as I did. I kind of wonder. I don't know. I think it has changed me, and I think it has changed a lot of particularly white collar workers who were able to work from home. I think we should acknowledge there are a lot of people who were not able to work from home ever during COVID. But I don't know if it's an industry-wide change, or if it's even a business-wide change, or if it really is just going to be something that has changed the people that experienced it. I'm not yet sure. I think we don't know.
I think that's fair. I think we're looking at that in higher education too. What is that? What does work from home look like when it's a student-facing role? Yes. So I think a lot of industries have their own specific questions, and yeah, I think I don't know is I think where a lot of us are.
I think that's right.
How this changed. Okay, so we got some questions in, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask one of these questions. I think it's going to be helpful for everybody who's even watching the recording. And then folks here, if you want to hold on, I'll go off. I'll stop the recording. So for those of you who are with us in the recording, I'm going to ask this question, and thank you for joining us. But so the one question I want to ask is about freelancing. Now I know we talked about this beforehand, and I know it's not been something that you did a lot, but I'm curious about your views. The exact question is, do you think it is more financially viable to be a freelance journalist with today's job market, or to be on staff? Or anything that you can kind of, if you're like, that's a great question, I don't know. Yeah. What are your thoughts about freelancing?
Sure. No, I think it's a great question. I want to acknowledge that my experience of freelancing is very limited, right? I did a little bit of freelancing after college, but I did it for a publication I already worked at. So I did it for Slate. I was not on staff at the time. I was sort of paid by, per piece. But I would say it's a different relationship than I think most freelancers have when they're coming in cold to a new publication or cold emailing an editor to try to pitch a story. Generally speaking, my intuition would be it is almost always safer to be on staff somewhere. That would be my guess. I sort of have seen freelance journalists sort of mock up spreadsheets of stories they're working on, whether they've been paid for them, whether, when they're supposed to be paid for them, how much, they're going to be paid for them. I think it's a lot of effort to organize yourself to make sure it is financially viable. Whereas I generally think like accepting a position on staff, there are benefits that come with that. And then there's also just sort of a basic, I think more security. That would be my intuition. I would encourage you to talk to actual freelancers who have done a little bit more of that work. In terms of sort of the broader picture of freelancing, one of the funny things about working at the Times is there's a lot of sort of internal freelancing. I have done this myself where, working on the morning newsletter is sort of my day job, but I pitch stories to other desks as well. I try to get stories in the Upshot, or I've done stories for the national desk. I've done stories for BizDay even. These are sort of efforts to pursue ideas that I wouldn't be able to in the context of the newsletter, and get experience and get clips and meet new editors. I guess the advice I would have for freelancing, I think one other reason it's more challenging is I think a freelance pitch really has to stand out from something that somebody on the staff can do, right? I think that's where it becomes challenging. I often discard ideas that I might otherwise try to pitch because we already have someone at staff who writes that, right? Like if I wanted to go cover a Senate race, the Senate race in Pennsylvania, we already have somebody who's doing that. There's probably not much that I can add that the desk doesn't already have. But if I do come in with sort of a new idea that is a little bit off the beaten path, it's not exactly in any reporter on staff's wheelhouse, that pitch I think is more likely to be accepted. So I think that's why it's a little bit more challenging too, is being a freelancer, I think requires you to put in a little bit more creativity. It requires a little more effort to craft the right pitch, find the right person to send it to. Whereas I think if you're on staff, your editor will, if you're covering a beat, something happens on the beat and that's your story for the day, right? That's your work for the day. There's a little bit less sort of legwork to come up with the story ideas. Or your editor will say, hey, I saw this. I think you should go write that. Or like for me on the morning, we'll have team discussions and, Dave and I will kick around an idea and we'll say, okay, that's our piece. Let's do that. So it's a little bit, there's less friction, I think, in coming up with story ideas when you are on staff. There's fewer layers, there's fewer hoops to jump through, and there's sort of less advanced work, I think, that you have to do if you're on staff versus freelancing. I hope that helps a little bit, but I'm happy to expand on any of that or go to another question.
Thanks, Ian. And I think maybe for those of us who are live, I'm going to take this opportunity to thank those of you who are watching the recording, and thank Ian for those of you that are leaving the recording now. And for those of you who are live, if you can just hold on a second.